Okay, hi, hello. If you did not get to join us for Super Saturday, I'm going to go ahead and go over the concepts and activities we covered for early Cold War, Vietnam, and the 60s. Okay, so if you look under the module for Super Saturday, you'll see that there's a link to a Google slideshow, and I'll show you how to access that in just a second. The first thing you need to make sure you do before we get started, make sure that you have that Google form pulled up. I also want to urge you to go ahead and look at the calendar. Okay, so as I'm recording this, it's the 27th, it's a Tuesday, but Super Saturday was the 24th. We now have exactly 1 week. So today's the 27th that I'm recording this until the STAR test, which means if you're watching this, you have less than a week till the STAR test. So make sure you're doing your best to study. And you've already taken the initiative to watch this video, which is awesome. So you are one step ahead. Okay. All right. I'm going to go ahead and show you on the module for Super STAR Saturday, which hopefully you still have up from your last teacher, where you can find the activity for the 60s. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll do the rest of this activity with my screen shared. We will go through it relatively quickly and I'll give you prompts to pause the video as we go so you can complete the activity in your own time. Okay. All right. So this is what my Super STAR Saturday resources folder looks like for my kids. And if you have a different teacher, it might look different for you depending on how they uploaded it. Okay. But if you scroll down a little bit, my session is the end of the that is not correct. My session is early Cold War, Vietnam, and the 60s. So what I have my mouse over right here, this is the activity we're going to be doing together. So if you click here, there is a link. It's going to ask you to make a copy. And when you open it, it should look something like this. And I'll go ahead and show you. So on Super Saturday, we did this activity together, and when you open it up, it might have the vocab boxes kind of to the side. The goal of this activity is to drag and drop the boxes to their corresponding categories on the Venn diagram. Now you can see here that this is already done on this version of the Venn diagram. If you want to, go ahead and scramble them up and then put them in the designated categories, you can do so. The goal of this video right now is just for us to go over the answers together. You're going to have 6 on either side. So these are the comparing elements here, or the contrasting elements. And then the similarities between the two wars are going to go in the middle. Okay. So in this activity, the main thing we're going to do is clarify some confusion between the Korean War and the Vietnam War. Both wars were fought against communism. So you can see here under causes, it says both wars were fought to prevent the spread of communism. So that's one thing that they have in common. They also get confused a lot because during both wars, first of all, Americans were in territories in Southeast Asia, or at least Eastern Asia. So that makes sense if you get them confused. Both countries were also divided into 2 parts during the war, with the 2 parts being a communist North and a democratic South. So that covers all of our similarities that we have listed here for both wars. Differences, kind of the easiest difference to remember for most students is timeline. Okay, so the Vietnam War is a lot longer than the Korean War. The Korean War, U.S. involvement is only about 3 years. So that's going to last from about 1950 to 1953. The Korean War, U.S. involvement is very short, and we'll explain why here in a second. The Vietnam War, U.S. involvement goes on for a long time. The beginning of the conflict in Vietnam, so the end of French imperialism in Vietnam, occurs around 1945, but the U.S. doesn't really become involved until 1950. The U.S. involvement will last until 1975, so quite a long time. You can see a huge difference between 25 years and 3 years. Okay, another big difference, the Vietnam War inspired a lot of protests, and hopefully in your class with your teacher, you talked about counterculture and the hippie movement and students protesting the war. If you didn't, you should at least take away from this unit that the Vietnam War was highly contested. Okay, some people really disagreed with it. Most Americans, however, did support the Korean War. So the Korean War was not as controversial. All right. How did both wars end? That's another huge difference. The Korean War, at the end of the war, the Korean Peninsula was split in two. So the North remained communist. It's still communist to this day. Kim Jong-un, Kim Jong-il, North Korean communism. That's something that we'll talk a lot about, especially towards reviewing the modern era. So hopefully your teacher talked a little bit under the Obama administration about North Korea. South Korea is a democratic government system supported by the US. That divide occurs at the 38th parallel. So that's a geographic point halfway or around halfway on the Korean Peninsula. Okay, at the end of the Vietnam War, the country is united. So Vietnam is not split in two at the end of the war, but it is under one communist government. So that's why in class you probably talked about America did not technically win Korea or Vietnam, okay, but they definitely didn't win the Vietnam War. The country ultimately ended up communist. So our goal to prevent the spread of communism was not successful in Vietnam. All right, how were both wars fought? What happened during the war? Well, the Vietnam War was mostly fought through guerrilla warfare. And if you think back to the American Revolution, you probably talked about this in middle school, maybe even at the beginning of this year. Guerrilla warfare is warfare that's disorganized, chaotic, and unpredictable. So the Vietnam War was marked by things like the Ho Chi Minh Trail, by tunnels under the Ho Chi Minh Trail where the enemy would pop up and surprise American troops. A lot of the warfare was fought in jungles with dense coverage, so it was really hard to track who was an enemy and who was an ally. So guerrilla warfare is really a key part to understanding the Vietnam War. Kind of dissimilar to this, the Korean War, at least the beginning of the Korean War, was organized by and led by General MacArthur. We talked about General MacArthur during World War II. He's very famous, very influential. He had a large part in the early victories of the Korean War. So you need to know General MacArthur is influential in Korea. All right, who did we fight against in Vietnam? We fought against the Viet Cong, which is the name of the Northern Vietnamese communist soldiers. You need to know for Korea that the Korean War is the first war involving troops from the United Nations. So when you talked about the UN at the end of World War II unit, kind of in that post-war era, the UN is really influential in stepping in and helping during the Korean War. Back to how both wars ended, if we look at the Korean War, that war ends unofficially with an armistice. So we do not have an official peace agreement for the Korean War. It's just kind of a more subtle agreement that the US is no longer going to be involved. The Vietnam War ends in an official peace accord. So President Nixon signs the Paris Peace Accords. You need to know that vocab word, Paris Peace Accord, officially ending US involvement. Okay, so hopefully the major things you picked up here, things that you really need to remember, Korea is a much shorter war than Vietnam. They do start around similar times, or US involvement starts around similar times. The Vietnam War is very controversial. It inspires many protests, especially because of the draft. Hopefully you talked about the draft in your class. The draft is where young U.S. men, when they turned 18, were eligible to be called on for the military. And during Vietnam, that was highly controversial. Okay, most Americans did support Korea, so that's a major difference. The type of war is also pretty different, guerrilla warfare versus more organized warfare. And then you need to know that at the end of Vietnam, Vietnam was united under one communist government. Korea was split in half. And then the armistice versus the peace agreement. Okay, so hopefully you got a good picture of the similarities and differences with the two wars. If not, I would take some time, scramble up these options and try to put them all back. That should be some good practice for you. And if you need help understanding what I mean by that, you can take these boxes and move them to the side and kind of scramble them up, which is what we did on Super Saturday. And then we put them all back together. All right, the other two activities on this slide that are very useful for you are going to be some games that I created on class tools. Okay, the first one is called Connect 4. This one's a little bit challenging, but it's a great way to look at connections between different vocabulary words. And it's going to go over primarily Vietnam and then some elements of the 60s. So if you click on this link here, it'll take you to a website called Class Tools. Let's read the directions together. It says, you will see a wall of 16 clues. You need to group them into 4 rows of 4 connected items. Simply click 4 cards to identify a group. You score 1 point for each group found within 2.5 minutes. So it is timed. You have unlimited guesses for the first 2 groups. After completing 2 groups, you have 3 chances to make the final 2 groups. After arranging all 4 groups, or when the time is run out, the correct groups are shown. You can earn 1 point per group for identifying the connection between them. If you spot all 4 groups and all 4 connections, you gain a 2-point bonus for a total of 10 points. It sounds really complicated. It's not. I'm going to show you for about 20 seconds or so how this works. And then I would encourage you to pause the video, to go to the link, and to try it out for yourself. Okay? So let's look. The Beatles is a band. So let's start there. Well, Bob Dylan is also a singer. Where else do we see something that might have to do with singing or culture of the 60s? Well, Elvis and Jimi Hendrix. All right, so we have 4 that go together. See, Apollo 11 is a space race. Neil Armstrong is an astronaut. Increase in science and education also had to do with the space race. And then let's see, what else could go with the space race? Let's go with Sputnik. Those are my first 2 categories of 4. And then I would take some time to organize the other ones into groups of 4. And I'm going to go ahead and do that very, very, very quickly. Okay, so you can see at the end, it connects it into 4 groups. So we had causes of the Vietnam War, election of 1960s, space race, and singers. So this is kind of what you'll be doing. My score at the end of this was 4 points, so not a whole lot. But hopefully you can do better than me, and you're just quickly trying to organize things and find a connection. So that's the first game. All right. The second game is called the Vortex, and this was my Super Saturday Kids favorite game that we did out of the 2. So what you're going to do is you're going to drag and drop a vocab card into the correct category or vortex. The quicker you are, the better you score. So I'm going to try to be pretty slow just so I can show y'all, but the categories for this game are things that prevented the spread of communism, vocab words that are part of Second Red Scare, vocab words part of the youth culture of the 50s. So that's when we talked about like movies and music and James Dean and stuff like that. And then space race. So if we click start. Okay, HUAC. This one might be a little bit difficult for some of you. So let's say that you don't remember. You can drag into a category. So I'm trying to choose ones that I know are wrong. until it slides in and it'll go into a spinny for the vortex. Okay, so it'll like spin off. Sputnik, obviously I know all the answers, right? I created it, but if you get it right, more points. You're trying to get as many of them until the timer runs out. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and exit this page because I don't want to give away all the answers. All right, so that's the activity in this. I would encourage you, if this is challenging to you, if you're having a hard time remembering, a great resource to use. See if I can pause my share for just a second. If you go to Crash Course US History, they have a really good one on Vietnam in the 60s. See if I can get it pulled up. And it also goes a little bit over as well. Sorry, y'all. Let me see if I can get this pulled all the way up. We didn't watch this on Super Saturday, but I did have it pulled up just as kind of a resource if kids wanted to use it. So you can see the YouTube channel name for this is called Crash Course. And then it's number 38. So if none of this sounded familiar to you and you want more of an in-depth review, I would encourage you to look through your resources from your class over Korea and Vietnam in the 60s, and also Crash Course number 38, okay? If you have any questions for me or your teacher, please reach out. Otherwise, it was great talking to y'all, and I hope you have a good afternoon.